Hi, Maggie. This is going to be English. I'm going to talk to you about Jane Austen, who wrote Pride and Prejudice, which was the book you were listening to a little bit back when. She wrote other books: Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Sense and Sensibility, Persuasion, and Mansfield Park, which I just finished listening to. I was going to talk to you about that, but I think that the more famous one for English classes for high school would be Pride and Prejudice. So, I'm going to read you some stuff. What is Jane Austen, the author's most famous book? Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen's most popular novel, earning 2 million five-star reviews on Goodreads, selling 20 million copies since it was published in the year 1813. This novel follows the witty and fascinating relationship between the beautiful Elizabeth Bennet and the proud Mr. Darcy. Now, Elizabeth Bennet was always making assumptions. She was proud, and she had a prejudice, so Pride and Prejudice. And he also was very proud, Mr. Darcy, and she always assumed he was arrogant and standoffish. Now let's see, why is Jane Austen, this author, important? First of all, she was a female author, and it was the year 1813. So she died in 1817 at age 41. Jane Austen is known for her 6 completed novels, among them the highly adapted Pride and Prejudice. That means they've made it into lots of movies, PBS specials, and you could even watch that and take time as English. We could talk about the comparison between the book and the movie, but if you don't listen to the whole book, it's no worries. But Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, both of them have a lot to do with male-female relationships, often with the woman in that era looking for and being taught to look for marrying a man with some wealth, because often women would end up being prostitutes or very poor, beyond any earning capacity. It was a very class system time, and this is in England, in Great Britain. So Austen's writing stands out for comedy, self-awareness, and realistic, detailed portraits of characters and their relationships. Now, I just finished reading Mansfield Park, and it's detailed in realistic characters. There's this one guy who literally says to his sister, "Oh, I'm going to go just make that young woman love me so that I can poke a hole in her heart, but I have no intention of loving her." And there was this one point in the story where I really thought he was falling in love with her, because then all of a sudden he was asking her to marry him, and he was sure he was in love with her, but it was only because she knew better, and she knew he had already been a scoundrel, and she was staying very standoffish and wasn't letting him poke this hole in her heart. And then at the very last minute, he took off with the girl he had flirted with before and took her from her husband. So I was really shocked in the Mansfield Park story. So let's see, Jane Austen. They ask, is there a real life Mr. Darcy? He was the main male character in Pride and Prejudice. He's actually based off, they say, John Parker, the first Earl of Morley. Morley was a British aristocrat who served in the House of Lords and whom was involved in a sordid sex scandal that led to divorce in 1809. Morley's second wife was a friend of Jane Austen, and her brother Henry knew the Earl in college. Now, this is interesting because Henry was the name of the scoundrel in the book I was just telling you about, which was Mansfield Park. Mansfield Park was the area where this poor girl Fanny went to live because her cousins decided they'd take her from her mom, who was the sister of the woman who lived in Mansfield Park, because she was wealthy and her sister was poor, and their sister had 10 kids, and they said, let's just take one of her kids for her. Wouldn't we be lovely if we took one of her kids? So they took Fanny, and then Fanny became a very smart, nicely behaved young woman, and she saw that her older cousin was flirted with by the scoundrel guy, and then he just took off and forgot about her. So the older cousin married this guy she didn't love, but he had a lot of money, and then the scoundrel guy came back and tried to get Fanny to fall in love with him because he wanted to pierce the hole in her heart, and then Fanny didn't trust him, and then she got sent back to her poor family's house in a town called Portsmouth, which was more of a city, and Mansfield Park was in the countryside. I think it was a big mansion, and she had grown up there for like 10 or 8 years, and so she went back to visit her family, and her family didn't really seem to care about her. The mom had other kids, and they were busy and just trying to get by. And so the scoundrel guy showed up, and he was very nice, and he was even nice to her father when he was being obnoxious and drunk and stuff. And so then Fanny sort of thought that she might like the guy, But then he took off, and she found out that he took off and found her older cousin and took her away from her husband. And I think they might have gone off and gotten married. Anyway, it's a very scandalous story, and I was just shocked by the whole thing. And then she wrapped it up really quickly at the end, which I feel like she did with a couple of the other ones, because I've now listened to Sense and Sensibility just before that, because I have this book on tape that puts them all one after the other. And I was listening to Pride and Prejudice saying, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can put Maggie through this one. Anyway, let's see. I'm just trying to find something useful to tell you about Jane Austen, and I can't really find much else. So, she wrote a long time ago when she was a woman, so that's a big deal. Let's see if we can find something about Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice was an 1830 novel of manners written by Jane Austen. Though it's mostly called a romantic novel, it's also a satire. The novel follows the character development of Elizabeth Bennet, the dynamic protagonist of the book, who learns about the repercussions of her hasty judgments. That's true. She did make very hasty judgments. She hated this guy, and then it turned out she had a bunch of sisters, and the mom was really flighty, and she wanted all of the sisters to marry well, and she'd talk about it, and it was really embarrassing because some of her sisters weren't, they were just sort of giddy and goofy, and her mom was sort of giddy and goofy. So Elizabeth was probably one of the sisters with the better head on her shoulder. Anyway, her father, Mr. Bennet, seemed like a good guy, and he had 5 daughters. His property wasn't going to go to him when he died because there was no male heir. So it was an era where there had to be a male to inherit the house. So then this weird lady who somehow owned the property signed it off to some cousin relative of theirs. And that cousin relative then came and decided that he'd ask Elizabeth to marry him, and then the house would be able to stay in the family. But he was kind of a guy she definitely didn't want to marry, and she let him know it. So they were facing being 5 daughters and a mother, and when the father would die, they would just be very poor. Okay, so that's Pride and Prejudice. That's the plot-ish. It just goes back and forth between Elizabeth thinking Mr. Darcy's a scoundrel, and then Mr. Darcy ending up helping her when they think, and it happened in all the other books too, they think one guy's a really good guy and he turns out to be the really scoundrel guy, and they thought one guy was a good guy, then he thought he was a scoundrel, then he was good. Anyway, it goes on and on and on and on, with all sorts of different characters. So I don't know if you're going to listen to that one, or if you listen to any of the other CDs I sent along, but I will stop there because that's 7 minutes of English, so you put that in your book as 0.25, which is a quarter of an hour.